Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Big Brother top 10 player ranking here, this time talking about the top 10 worst players to make the jury. Again, this is a video that I talked about doing at the time that I did my top 10 worst players of all time video, because I think this would be an interesting concept, because obviously when people talk about the worst players of all time, a lot of people that people like to mention are the people that make relatively deep runs, but play pretty mediocre games along the way. But again, to me, when you're talking about the top 10 worst players of all time, I do feel like the majority of those people are people that are earlier boots, as at least the people that made it further into the game at least showed the potential to make it deeper into the game. So this video will be talking about the top 10 worst to make the jury, which I feel like will be at least a bit more in line with people's perceptions of the worst players of all time. However, I will say that even then, I was actually surprised at how this list turned out, where I feel like there's so many notable figures that people point out as the worst player of all time that didn't quite make my top 10 here. Now, I should mention that there won't be any BB2 or BB3 players on the list, largely because everyone was on the jury, which makes it just really arbitrary to add them here. Also no BB1 because it's BB1. But before we get into that, let's run through the long list of dishonorable mentions here. This will be in chronological order of when they first made the jury. So first up, from BB6, I did consider Howie. Howie is someone that I think we were only going based off of his BB6 appearance. I think definitely would have been consideration for the list. And while his BB7 appearance is not good, to me at least it showed consistency in the fact that he was able to make jury 2 times. And both of those times he did have a solid grouping around him. It's not like he was the social pariah in the house. However, again, like his move to get rid of James in BB6 is pretty bad, but again, not enough to quite land him on the list. From BB7, I really consider Chicken George. I really thought Chicken George was going to make the list. However, to me, he kind of fits into this grouping of players that, while played a mediocre game, is also a very playable figure in the house, and is someone that is not going to actively blow up their games, which to me is a bigger indication of a poor player on Big Brother, of how much someone is actively going to sabotage their own game, than someone like Chicken George, who just isn't really playing the game, but is also still likable enough and also like a non-threat to the point where he's being kept around. But again, Chicken George was pretty close to making the list. Also consider Dustin, which again had a really bad move at the final 9 of BB8. However, I feel like his game before that was fine enough. Again, he was in the majority alliance. He was actually in a decent position, probably would have still been in a decent position had it not been for America telling Eric to flip on him. But again, like at the end of the day, still not a good player, but didn't quite make the list. Also consider, this is probably a major one, we got Kathy from BB12, who again fits into that Chicken George mold to me. Again, a player that is pretty playable. Again, one that isn't going to do anything well, but also doesn't actively do anything poorly either. I will say the one thing about Kathy, though, is the fact that she was booted much earlier in the game than someone like a Chicken George, but still not enough to quite make her on the list. Next up, another person that gets noted a lot is Adam Pock from BB13. Again, I just don't think Adam is the worst of the worst. While he is definitely a floater in the game, someone that does go to whoever has power, I don't think he plays that poorly. Like, I don't think he makes suboptimal moves that often in the game, and was well enough positioned for the majority of the game. So again, he didn't quite make the list for me. We got a decent amount of contenders here from BB14. First up, we have Frank, who, I mean, Frank is a player that I loved when I first watched BB14, but Frank did not play a good game. Again, someone that really banked on competition wins for a lot of it, had so much potential to be a pre-juror many times across the season. And while you can say that, okay, he survived the week against Cara because of solid gameplay there, and same thing with him being on the block against Janelle, but like at the end of the day, again, like I just feel like he is a very high variance player on that season, but still not enough to quite make the top 10. Also consider Joe, who again kind of fits into the Chicken George, Kathy mold. I will say I actually think Joe is probably better than them in the sense that I think Joe is more actively playing. Like we see Joe trying to cut deals. We see him make a final 2 with Shane that he was trying to honor. Like I do think he was actually playing the game a bit more, and because that didn't quite make the cut. Also consider Jen, which again, similar thing. Now I don't know how much more actively playing Jen was. Like I would say Joe's more actively playing than Jen, but I would say Jen was actually probably more effective in making social bonds, especially towards the end of the game with her relationships with Danielle and Dan, that if it had not been for Dan kind of being forced to take out Jen, I do think Jen could have potentially made a solid run at the end there. Not enough to be in the top 10. Next up, we got Gina Marie. And Gina Marie was someone that I really wanted to put on the top 10. However, again, the reason I didn't is for a couple things. One, I do think competition ability. She is a solid competitor that could save her in some pretty sticky situations. But also, more notably, is I feel like she was part of the majority alliance towards the back portion of the game. And while part of that is due to the fact that they didn't think that she could win a jury vote, I do feel like for me that is enough to not quite crack the top 10. From BB16, I did consider Jocasta, and Jocasta was, again, like in this mold of the Kathy, the Chicken Georges, someone that wasn't playing the game but was also playable enough, and someone I don't think is going to actively sabotage their game, so didn't quite make the list. And the same thing goes for probably one of the bigger names on the board here. We got Victoria. Again, I really considered Victoria, but again, Victoria to me like just isn't going to sabotage her own game. She's not going to blow up her own game in the way that a lot of the people on the main list are going to. So while I obviously don't think Victoria is a good player, she didn't quite crack the top 10. From BB17, I did consider Julia. Mainly because I don't feel like Julia ever makes a move in the game that I found that impressive. I mean, she does build this really strong bond with Vanessa, but that just allows her to be manipulated by Vanessa towards the end game, particularly in the week that she eventually goes home. And most of the rest of her game was kind of handed to her through her being part of the twin twist and Liz having this showmance with Austin. So I don't know how much active Julia ended up doing, but again, not enough to quite make the list. BB18 here, we have a lot of contenders. First up, we have Davon. Again, pretty close to making the list, but also has a decent strategic mind, I guess. I mean, like, she's good at reading people. I think that's really the biggest pro of Davon's game ability, is that she is able to read situations pretty well. The problem is that her decision making on what to do with those reads is pretty poor. And I feel like on the 2 seasons that she has returned for after her first appearance, she was in a pretty good spot on those returns and kind of actively sabotaged her position both times. So again, I don't feel good about her as a player, but again, not quite enough to reach the top 10. Also consider Bridget, with Bridget being one of these people that like was never really in the majority the entire time she was in the game. She was aligned with the Jose crowd earlier on, and eventually lines with Frank, but is always on the bottom, which is the main reason she was in contention here. But again, I feel like she seems to have a good enough strategic mind, and also does help in the flip against Paulie to where she doesn't quite make the list. Also considered Michelle, which is kind of a similar thing. But Michelle was at least part of a majority for longer, and she was part of the majority early on in the game. And was also later integrated within the James and Natalie contingent that, again, leaves her off this list because I think outside of that she was a pretty poor player. Also considered Victor, who, again, someone that was booted 3 times on his season. But I do think Victor was a pretty consistent physical competitor and really isn't the worst player in the world, especially on his return, where I feel like he did do well enough after he came back from the bow back to where he was decently positioned in the game, even though he was always going to be an endgame threat. But again, like, not enough to quite make the top 10. From BB19, I also considered Matt, and Matt obviously has this really notorious move of him not using the veto on himself. And while it obviously worked out for him, I mean, I think that is a very bad indication of him as a player. However, again, like, I feel like Matt is probably someone that is going to be more consistent in the game, and is someone that is very playable enough to where, like, I don't see Matt being inconsistent in the game on multiple appearances, so he didn't quite make the top 10. Have a lot of contenders from BB20, which is essentially the entire Falte alliance outside of Haley. But to be fair, it's not like Haley was that great either, but again, considered Bailey, though Bailey's not on there because again, I feel like she is a solid player that really just has a fatal flaw in her getting too wrapped up in her emotions and believing that like social relationships means that they're in alliances, and I feel like that's the issue with Bailey. But again, not enough to be top 10. Rockstar, I feel like, was a pretty mediocre player as well. Someone that was kind of clueless for a lot of the game, but she does kind of get screwed over by a twist in her actual boot week, so again, didn't quite make the list. Scotty is someone that was actually probably the closest to making the top 10 for me, where, I mean, Scotty obviously has his own alliance member in Fessy, end up taking him out. Scotty also was never really well integrated within the house, always being on the bottom of like the Falte grouping. He also thought he had the loyalty of Tyler, which he never did. Like, to me, Scotty's a pretty bad player but one that seemed okay enough in competitions, and he does end up nominating Brenton Winston, so I think there is some gameability there, but again, still not a good player. And then obviously with Fessy, who is someone that is mentioned a lot as one of the worst players. Again, to me, Fessy at least was able to be part of the core majority alliance. Again, like even though Falte ends up crumbling, Falte was the majority alliance early on in the game, and he seemed to fully have the loyalty of people like a Swaggy and eventually like a Bailey later on in the game. Obviously Haley, like he did have very solid allies in the game. It's just that he's not the greatest strategically. But again, for me, that's not quite enough to be top 10. For BB21, I did consider Jessica. And Jessica was very, very close to making the list. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that she did target Jack, I think she for sure would have been on the list, as I think her game was pretty terrible outside of that. And even within that, like her nominating Jack and Jackson that week is a massive mistake, as it really just opened up the possibility of Christy being able to use her power. But either way, again, like I feel like it was enough to not quite make top 10. And the final person we'll be talking about here in the honorable mentions is David, who obviously had a very bad run on BB22, but there's a couple things here. One, that he was able to be the last person standing essentially out of the committee, and was even then like almost able to flip the votes onto Nicole F. You also have the fact that he was able to do some decent work on BB21 in terms of his reads on the house. I mean, again, that's enough for me to not quite make top 10. But there we go. That's all the honorable mentions. Let's get into the main list. The top 10 worst players to make the jury. To me, at number 10, we do have one of the more notable ones. From BB19, we do have Raven. Now, Raven was actually borderline on the list. Again, for me, it was a debate between Raven and Jessica for this final spot. And I did go with Raven just because, again, like for me, Jessica had at least one round of solid gameplay. Raven's a weird one because like Raven was part of the majority alliance for a good chunk of the season. However, a problem for me is the fact that she was kind of on the bottom of the majority alliance and didn't realize it for the majority of the season. I mean, Paul always planned on cutting Raven and Matt before he cut Alex and Jason or Christmas and Josh. It's like Raven and Matt were always on the bottom of that alliance. So that's something that isn't particularly great. Obviously, you have to factor in Raven is Raven, and I think she annoys the majority of the people that she's on the cast with, especially after the first initial weeks. Like, obviously, she was able to use the sob story as a way to gain some social capital early on, but never really does much with it, and just, again, like, ends up annoying people. Again, people end up figuring out that she's not being truthful with most things, which I think ends up lessening her credibility. I feel like it's very tough to imagine Raven ended up winning a jury vote unless she's against like Matt at the end, to which Matt probably would have given up his game for her. But like, I mean, like, I just can't imagine a world where Raven wins. But even then, Matt's plan was to throw his game at 3 to let Paul and Raven get to the end, to which Paul would have probably beaten Raven at that point. And just in terms of her one appearance, it was obviously a bad game, but not quite enough to be top 10. For me, it's more so looking at her potential on future seasons that does make me put her in the top 10 here, where I do feel like BB19 was probably one of her better case scenarios in terms of how she performs on a season, where I do think she had a cast that did end up benefiting her, and even that ended up leading to still a mediocre run in a position where she had no real winning scenarios. So again, for me, I just can't look at Raven as that good of a player. She's here at number 10. Now, number 9 is someone that kind of fits into the Chicken George, the Cathys, like that sort of mold. And while this person's probably the most fun character of the bunch, I do feel like is also the worst player because of how fun of a character she is. At number 9, we do have Renny, where again, like Renny to me is very similar to that of like a Kathy or a Chicken George, but is also a much more abrasive personality. And through that comes off as very annoying and has a lot of potential to be a first boot, as we even saw in this season, where she was instantly targeted week 1 because of the fight she had with Jesse. And I feel like just in general, Renny is someone that has no real awareness of the game. Now, I will say that my BB10 live feed knowledge is very lacking, and especially my knowledge of the jury. But I don't suspect that Renny was close to winning. I would suspect that Renny wasn't well respected by the jury. And I feel like on especially a modern season of the show, I don't think a jury is going to reward Renny with the win. I do feel like the juries have gotten more and more game focused, and because that, again, like I just don't think Renny has much potential there, and I feel like she has so much downside in terms of her being an earlier boot, and even beyond that, doesn't really get the strategic elements of the game. So because of that, for me, Renny lands at number 9. Now, number 8 is a player that I struggled with where exactly to place her, as there was a point where this person was higher, there was a point where this person was off the list. I really struggled with where exactly to go with her. But at number 8, we do have Lydia from BB11. Now, Lydia for me is not only these people kind of similar to a Raven, where she was kind of in the majority group, but was always on the bottom of that majority group. But even then, she was like barely in the majority group. She does start week 1 actually being in kind of a decent position, kind of being in the middle of the game. But through her eventually siding with the Jesse side of things, which again, I don't fault her for, considering it was to take out Braden, who was someone that was just being a massive dick to her. I do think that led to her getting a lot of the brunt of the blame for the eventual Braden vote off. She's also just a very confrontational figure. I mean, we do see her get into confrontations with Jeff and Jordan constantly, especially the one that leads to her eventual downfall, where on the week that she ends up going home, it doesn't really make sense for them to be targeting Lydia, but considering how volatile Lydia ended up being during that week, it kind of forced their hand into voting her out. Again, also with the fact that she was just on the bottom of the alliance, and her own alliance tried to vote her out multiple times and almost was successful in voting her out on the week that Ronnie went home. It's like the only real ally she had throughout the game was Kevin, and even Kevin was willing to let her go. So realistically, again, I don't think Lydia is that good of a player. I don't think she really did anything that well across the season outside of putting herself in a decent enough position in week 1, but even then kind of sabotages it along the way. Again, for me, Lydia lands here number 8. Now, number 7. This might be a bit of a cop-out because this is technically 2 players. But at number 7, we do have Natalie and Adria from BB5, the twins. Now, this is kind of a weird one because I don't know exactly which one is worse than the other. But to me, Natalie and Adria really played really poorly by the time they came back into the game after the twin twist. It's like they were actually playing okay enough on their own, where they were part of the majority group with all the other women, and they were kind of in the middle where the 4 horsemen were trying to pick them up as a number. And that's a decent spot to be in. The problem is that the instant they got power, they blew up their own games. Now, this is the part where I'm a bit hesitant on which one is worse, where to me, I feel like Adria was clearly the worst in terms of how much of a power trip they went on. Now, both of them went on a power trip for sure, but I feel like Adria definitely takes a lot of the brunt of the blame for that, but also is the one that is more capable in competitions and won the competition that put him in that position to have any semblance of power. So for me, I don't know which one is exactly worse than the other, but either way, they're both really bad. They both pretty much played the same game up until that point. Both went on this massive power trip of talking about how God told them who to nominate, but that ends up blowing up their game, where moving forward, they're social pariahs to where they're taken out back to back immediately afterwards. And even if they had gotten to the end of that point, I can't imagine them winning a jury vote, considering how much respect they lost from the move. So again, bad players all around, but I decided to group them together just because I can't really decide which one's worse. So they end up landing here at number 7. At number 6, kind of a similar game here, but slightly worse in the fact that they made the move around earlier. And at number 6, we do have Dana from BB4. Now, Dana, again, to me, also is in a similar tier to a Natalie and Adria, of someone that was okay positioned early on in the game, but ends up making a move way too early, and through that sabotages any potential they had in the game. Now, I will say with Dana, I do feel like her position was a lot more fragile than it was Natalie and Adria's, which is actually a bigger knock against her, to the fact that I don't think Dana was ever well positioned in the game. But even after she makes the move to try to blindside Allison, fails in doing so, gets rid of David, she really just burns all of her social capital at that point. She burns her relationship with Allison and Nathan. She burns her relationship with Erica and Jack. She builds a relationship with the Three Stooges with that move, but not to the point where they're willing to keep her around, to the point where by the time it's her on the block against June, they're willing to cut her over June, despite her probably being a better ally for them than June. So again, for me, that's all pretty bad. Again, Dana's kind of another major example of a person who made a move a bit too early, and it's probably someone that I don't really have much confidence in ever making the move at the right time. So because that, Dana's here number 6. Now, number 5, moving on to another person who was in a similar sort of grouping, never someone that I thought was in that good of a position, and that person is Ashley from Big Brother 14. Now, Ashley is someone that, again, similar to last week we talked about, tried to make a move, but something worse than like a Dana or a Natalie and Adria, like wasn't even actually able to make the move. Like her move was at the final 10. She decides to flip over to Boogie and Frank and tries to keep Boogie in the game and completely fails in doing so, leading to her eventually being taken out immediately afterwards at the double eviction. But even before that, again, like Ashley was kind of already on the bottom, not really in a power position throughout the entirety of the game. I mean, she was part of Janelle's team that was kind of the decision maker in keeping Frank around in the first round, and like was technically in the majority during the JoJo boot week. But beyond that, once Dan and Brittany's teams kind of got together and were able to get any semblance of power, like Ashley's just kind of there for a lot of the rest of the game. Doesn't really do much actively within the game, and does have that pretty bad move that at the one point where she decides to start playing the game, ends up sabotaging her game to where she's immediately the next boot afterwards. Again, to me, Ashley also played a pretty poor game here. She's here at number 5. Now number 4, moving on to a player that I love as a character, but is still a terrible player. And here we do have Jen from BB8. Now, I think the one redeeming thing to me about Jen is that she is competent in competitions. While she's not like the best competitor in the world or anything, like she is a solid competitor. But almost everything else about her game is very bad to me. Again, she's someone that also never really had any allegiances in the game, never had any real power. Like her plan was to get rid of Dick week 2, fails in doing so. Another minor pro is the fact that she was able to build such a strong bond with Kale, but Kale was also someone that was on the bottom at that point, and really just led to them being nominated together for 3 weeks in a row. And even beyond that, like when we get to the point where Jen does save Dick at the final 9, she has won the votes to keep him around there. They just instantly flip on her at final 8 anyway and take her out immediately afterwards. I mean, Jen is just someone that has no social capital throughout the season, fails in getting rid of her target in the only chance that she really had to do so, and later decides to keep that person around only for him to immediately vote her out the next round anyways. So again, like I don't see much positive in Jen's game outside of her competition ability, but that's not really enough to leave her off the list. She's here at number 4. Now at number 3, we're having the person that inspired this entire video. This is the person that made me create this concept to begin with. At number 3, from BB23, we do have Derek F. And yeah, Big D here, again, like played a really bad game. I mean, he is the only person to make the top 10 here to actually make it to the final 2. Like, the thing about Big D is that, again, had it not been for the cookout, I think Big D is probably booted around like 10th, 11th place. There were people that continuously wanted to target him despite him never having a chance of winning the game. No one ever talked about Big D as a potential winner of the season, yet he was still being constantly targeted by the likes of like a Claire and a Derek X who wanted to take him out to get rid of a potential GOAT later on in the game. You had people like a Tiffany and a Hannah who wanted Big D to be one of the first people out of the cookout even by the time they get to the end of the game. You even had a Kylan who didn't even want to take Big D to the end despite Big D being as easy to beat at the end. You had Azza, who planned on taking Big D to the end the entire time until Big D sabotages his own game and getting her to want to take Xavier at the very end. And Big D plays such a bad game despite the fact that he does get to the very end. And the only reason he seemed to be in the majority alliance was largely because of the fact that there was the cookout. I didn't think he is a player that was greatly benefited by the time that he played. Where I think if he had been on BB21, BB20, or any of these other previous casts, like he doesn't even get as far as he does. But even here, he was still targeted despite the fact that he had no chance of winning the game. I think Big D is a terrible player. He's here at number 3. Now number 2, moving on to a player that I can very much debate this person being number 1. I do think 1 and 2 here are pretty interchangeable. I think they're both really bad for completely different reasons, though. Obviously, I gave the slight edge to this person. At number 2, we do have Sam from BB20. And Sam is a very tough player to assess. She's obviously a very emotional player, a player that doesn't really get the game. I don't think she was ever someone that understood the game in any aspect. Obviously made like crazy moves like targeting Caitlyn and Haley because of the way that they acted around men, and you had her almost planning on nominating her closest ally in JC until he literally told her not to, and she changes her mind in an instant. I mean, she is a very sporadic player, and one that I don't think had any respect from a jury. I don't think she ever wins a jury vote if she gets to the end, unless there was a bitter element to it. And even then, I don't think she wins any scenario in BB20. However, the one massive pro for me is the fact that she was able to create this bond with Tyler and Casey that was able to carry her through the game. Where unlike the next person we'll be talking about, that person never survives a single round of the game without some sort of protection. Sam at least was able to build strong enough social bonds to carry her through the game. And while that's like the only positive in her game where everything else is very, very negative, to me that was enough to land her here at number 2. Now number 1. At number 1, worst player to make the jury to me has to be Cody Nickson from BB19. Again, to me, Cody plays a pretty abysmal game. Again, he is the first HOH and through that is safe. Tries to get rid of Paul, and while there are a lot of twists along the way that stop him from doing so, he's still unsuccessful in getting out his next target in Christmas. That puts him on the bottom. He's immediately backdoored the very next week, is out of the game, has to come back around later, to which he's again put in a position where he needs to essentially win out. Jessica wins HOH, the only person that was going to keep him safe there, and he follows that up with the halting hex that keeps him safe. After that, you have the temptation competition that he ends up winning that keeps him safe there, only for him to be immediately taken out the next round, the first round of the jury. Again, like there's not much positive to really say here. The main positive for me is competition ability. I think he is well above average in the competition aspect of the game. I do also feel like he did okay work initially in creating an initial power structure. The problem is I do think Paul did a much better job in being able to counter that power structure. Or again, like Cody does technically create this power structure of him, Jessica, and Matt and Raven, and Mark and Elena that could have controlled the game had he not been so gung-ho on flipping the game on Paul. But again, I will say that I feel like there is a semblance of potential there for Cody. That did make me debate over him being number 1 or number 2. However, based on the proof that we have over the course of the one season that he did play, I can't have much faith in him not sabotaging his own game. And because I do have to land Cody here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my top 10 worst players to make the jury for Big Brother. Obviously, stay tuned for more Big Brother rankings down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.